Gentlemen and ladies fair that grace New Orleans city, come listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. And for the opportunity, consider yourself lucky. It is not often that you see a hunter from Kentucky.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, whenever you guys are watching this. Welcome to APUSH Review Chapter 10. That brings us to a very big chapter, lots of stuff in this, very controversial presidency, and that would be of Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is a guy we've briefly introduced before. We introduced him at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, that big hero that wound up winning that battle for us even though the war was over. And then we also mentioned him when we talked about the annexing of Florida, okay, because he went into Florida to get some slaves and stuff. So, the Jacksonian era, he is a champion of the people. We're going to find out why he is the common man's man. We'll see what that means. But we have to start with his story to the presidency in 1824. Andrew Jackson runs to the presidency in 1824, and the election of 1824 is very controversial, maybe even more controversial in 2020. Who knows? What happens is, in 1824, we see the ending of the era of good feelings. And remember, the last 2 weeks, we've talked about the era of good feelings being this sense of high nationalism, patriotism, and one political party reigning, the Democrat Republicans. And this political party, the Democratic Republicans, they've reigned without, opposition. The Federalists are done since the Hartford Convention. But now we have to see why the era of good feelings comes to an end with this election. What makes it so controversial? Let's talk about the four candidates. All four of these guys are claiming to be Democratic Republicans, even though they have, pretty much different views on certain things, certain issues. We know most of them. John Quincy Adams, remember, he is the Secretary of State, the foreign policy guru. We'll talk more about in a little while his accomplishments. Next, Henry Clay, we introduced him a couple of weeks ago with his American System, which included the bank and tariffs and internal improvements. Andrew Jackson, as we know, we've introduced him already today. And William Crawford, we don't really know him in this class too well, but he was the incumbent Secretary of Treasury. That means he was Secretary of Treasury to Monroe. Okay, so what's the controversy? Well, first, let me ask you this. How do you win the presidency? You need to win the Electoral College. Okay, you remember that from our YouTube video a couple of weeks ago, Chapter 6. You need to win the Electoral College, okay? And the Electoral College is set up so that we have what our forefathers believed in, intelligent people voting. Because remember, not everybody could vote at this time, and it was set up in the way that you need to receive a majority of electoral votes. So if you don't remember what the Electoral College is, I will direct you to go back to our Chapter 6 video, okay? So please do that. Anyways, the Constitution says, okay, the Electoral College must be won to win the presidency, okay? It needs to win a majority. The problem is, in this election, not one of the four candidates wins a majority. So what happens? Well, the Constitution says if that were to happen, the House of Representatives is going to determine the next president, and that's exactly what happens. So here's where the controversy comes into play. Okay, even though more people in America voted for Andrew Jackson, that's called the popular vote, that means nothing. Okay, the popular vote means nothing. Example, 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, doesn't mean she's president. Okay, so here's the controversy. We have something called the corrupt bargain go down. It's basically between three candidates, okay? Crawford, he's kind of out. No one really wants him to be president. Sorry, dude. But Jackson is kind of passed over because he's a Washington outsider, okay? He's not really from a wealthy family. No one really knows him in politics. He's not part of the founding fathers' families. Whereas you have John Quincy Adams, his dad was John Adams. He's obviously been around. People know him in Washington and politics. And then you have Henry Clay, who's been in Congress now for about a decade. And people know those two guys better than they do Andrew Jackson. Okay, the common people like Andrew Jackson, not necessarily people in Washington. So basically, it comes down to Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and behind closed doors, as the House of Representatives are going to make their vote for who's going to be the next president, Henry Clay, okay, and John Quincy Adams, they talk, and John Quincy Adams says, listen, it's my time, okay, I'm the incumbent Secretary of State, I should be the next president, I have a good resume, you're kind of young, Henry Clay, you have your resume is pretty good as well, but I'll make you my Secretary of State if you tell all of your followers to vote for me in the House of Representatives to be the next president. Henry Clay says, okay, you're right. If I'm Secretary of State to you, that means I'm probably going to be the next president. As we've mentioned, that is a stepping stone for the presidency. And that's exactly what happens, okay? Andrew Jackson gets screwed out of all of this. He is left out. John Quincy Adams becomes our next president, and Secretary of State goes to Henry Clay. Okay, so our next president, the sixth president of the United States, that would be John Quincy Adams. And like we said before, he is very well known at this point. He's got a really good resume. He has been our Secretary of State now under James Monroe. And remember, we mentioned he's like a foreign policy guru, where he was known for these four things at least, and many things more. But the Rush-Bagot Treaty, you don't have to know that, but that was a demilitarizing of the Great Lakes region between us and England. The second thing was the British or Anglo-American Convention. This we did talk about. This was the England and America agreeing to jointly occupy Oregon country. The Adams-Onis Treaty, we also mentioned, that was when we were able to acquire Florida. Remember Andrew Jackson's controversy with that. And then you read about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is in 1823 under James Monroe, in which it says that Europe, we are telling Europe to stay on their side of the world. Okay, I always tell my students it's a mind your own hemisphere, basically kind of message saying, hey, listen, Europe, you stay on your side of the world, you do you, and we'll mind us. Okay, we want to be the #1 country on our side of the world. Okay, so we really had no business saying that in 1823. We honestly are still very weak. But the reason we get away with it is because the rest of the, Europe is recovering after the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon just died, and everybody just wants to take a chill pill. All right, but those were all John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, his foreign policy masterpieces, if you will. Now, as president, he doesn't experience these same level of success because he never really has a majority of support within the two other branches, especially Congress. It's very hard for a president to get things done on their agenda when they don't have support of Congress. And it doesn't matter what president you talk about, if the two different branches, if there's a majority of one party in one branch and a majority in another, they don't really work cohesively. And also the whole idea of the corrupt bargain is really hanging over his head the entire presidency, because obviously Andrew Jackson is going to be very upset that he got screwed out of the presidency and will make this very well known in public. So anyways, what you're going to see now is a split between the Democratic Republicans. They are, we said they were reigning for like a 10, 12-year period of, uncontested politics. But now with this controversy of 1824, the Democratic Republicans split. And those that are going to continue following Adams, we're going to call them the National Republicans for now. And then the Democratic Republicans, okay, are going to be the Jacksonians, okay, the people that follow the Jackson era. And we're going to wind up calling the Democratic Republicans the Democrats. Okay, but both of these names will change a little bit, and we'll talk more about, later on. So 4 years go by, John Quincy Adams, He will lose his re-election to Andrew Jackson, as you can see there, the political map, the electoral college. Okay, pretty much everyone wants Andrew Jackson to be president, and Andrew Jackson is now our 7th president of the United States. So this is now the dawning of the age of the common man. You can see people at the White House having a big party there, really excited that he is the new president. Why is he the age of the common man? Just a little bit about his background. Like I said before, he is not from wealth. He is not, from a family of the founding fathers. He's our first president that was not part of the founding father families. Okay, every president thus far was either at the Constitutional Convention or part of their family was. But Jackson is now the first president that is not. Okay, he is a farmer. He's a Southerner, and he is, deemed or viewed as this age of this common man, where, people feel like one of us is in the White House, and so people are very excited about that. One of the things also leads this, whole mirage that Andrew Jackson is one of us, one of the people, is that you're going to see what we call the democratization of American society, meaning more and more states are allowing more people to vote. One of the things that you see under the Jackson era is that the amount of voters triples. Okay, so why? Well, what kind of people were able to vote in the very beginning of our country? Rich, white, landowning men. If you get rid of just one of those requirements, okay, the property requirement, okay, now you're going to see the amount of voters triple, okay? So you can see from 1800 to 1830, okay, the amount of voters, the amount of states, not only added to the Union, but the amount of states that are allowing, property to not be a requirement is a big deal. The amount of voters triples, okay? And this, again, if you allow more regular people to vote, they're definitely going to vote for Andrew Jackson because he is a man of the people and a lot of people like him. So other ways in which we see changes or more people being part of our government, our democracy. And again, I wouldn't really focus too much on these first two bullet points, but they're worth mentioning. Before Andrew Jackson, we had something called the caucus system, in which just a small group of people would select the candidate to be the next president. We're talking like 20 to 30 people. And again, when we're saying people, I'm talking about rich, wealthy, landowning white men. Now, after Andrew Jackson, we changed that to what's called a party convention system. And again, this is what we have today. This means that the whole political party will nominate someone to be the next president for that political party. So, in 2020 we have the election obviously, and there was conventions for each political party, the Democrats and the Republicans, and again, you and I could buy tickets to go to it, and what you'll see is all of the Democrats in Congress, okay, go to or attend this convention, and they have a vote by the end, okay, they have, okay, let's hear the arguments for this person to be the candidate, this person, at the very end they have a vote. That's a way more democratic system than the caucus system. So again, this is what we have today, and we moved to this after Andrew Jackson. The thing you do need to know on this slide is the very bottom, the last bullet point, the spoils system. Spoils system is really something that we associate with Andrew Jackson. However, he's not the only president to have ever done this. Spoils system means that when you become or when you receive office, you get into office, that you reward your supporters and your friends with public offices. However, this really is, not a good thing to do, because remember, you could be giving a position to somebody who really doesn't deserve it and is not qualified. So you must be wary of that. Even though I said Andrew Jackson is the one we associate with doing this, like I said, he's also not the only one to ever do this, but he is the one that does it on a large scale, because what happens is, if you remember, he's really bitter, really upset about losing the presidency in 1824. So when he becomes president, he's really going to kick everybody out that he can and bring in his own people. Okay, that's the spoil system. We get rid of the spoil system after the assassination of President Garfield because Garfield was killed by a guy who believed that he was owed a government job. And so after Garfield, we move to what we have today, where we have the civil service exams that allow people to take a test and says whether or not they're qualified for that position. Okay, that brings us now to a really horrible thing that happens in Jackson's presidency. It has to do with the Native Americans. In 1830, there's something called the Indian Removal Act that is passed. And again, you've probably heard of this back in middle school. But the Indian Removal Act is exactly what it sounds like. It means that the Indians, the Native Americans in places like Florida, Georgia, etc., they were forced westward, okay? They were supposed to be removed from those lands and forced westward past the Mississippi River. Now, the reason Jackson wants this done is because he wants their land for white settlers, white farmers. So the Native Americans, they're not just going to go, be removed without a fight. And no, they don't fight physically. We don't have a war or a battle here. The way they fight is they actually take this to court, which is interesting. And you're going to see the famous court case called Worcester versus Georgia. Okay, and Worcester versus Georgia is a Supreme Court case that you really must know. This is the Worcester tribe is a Cherokee tribe. It's a subunit, if you will, of the Cherokee tribe, and Georgia being the state. So the Native Americans are fighting to say, hey, listen, you can't make us leave. Now, John Marshall, okay, the Supreme Court Chief Justice at that time, he rules on the case and actually rules in favor of the Native Americans. You might be confused a little bit. You say, wait, what? I'm pretty sure in middle school I remember the Trail of Tears. You're right. That all does happen. I'm not lying to you. However, the surprise, the shock, okay, John Marshall rules in favor of the Native Americans. My next question to you is, whose job in our government is it to enforce laws? The president. Okay, it's the president. That would be Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson tells John Marshall, you do it. Okay, make me enforce it. And John Marshall doesn't have that power. That's not his job. Now, you may also be thinking, wait, when the president breaks the rules, when they break the law, aren't they or can't we make them accountable for something? Yes. And if the president breaks the rules, breaks the law, then we call that impeachment. So, if a president is impeached, it means they're brought to trial. Doesn't mean they're necessarily kicked out of the presidency. Again, Chapter 6, we talked about this. If a president is impeached, okay, they go to trial, and if they win, they remain president. If they lose, they're kicked out. What happens with Andrew Jackson? Is he impeached? No, he is not impeached. Why? Why didn't they impeach him? Well, the real reason is because a bunch of congressmen who are composed of rich, wealthy white dudes do not care about impeaching a president because of Native Americans. That's the unfortunate truth. And the Trail of Tears does happen, and they'll be forcibly removed from their lands in the southeast to go west of the Mississippi River. Very horrible time in our country's history. Okay, very sad time. Okay, and you can just see on that here, Trail of Tears. Not exactly your hike that you want to go on this weekend. Okay, let's talk about another event that goes down in Jackson's presidency, also very controversial. This is called the Nullification Crisis. You may recognize the word nullification or to nullify. Remember, we talked about that word means to not listen to. So let's see what this means. So in 1828, okay, Andrew Jackson, right, he's now president. He gets elected in 1828, and there's a tariff passed, and it's referred to as the Tariff of Abominations. Now, before we get into that, what's a tariff? A tax on imported goods, right? We make foreign-made goods more expensive. Northerners like tariffs, okay, and Southerners usually hate it. Remember, Northerners have the factories, so they don't really need to import much. Southerners don't have factories, so they need to import more goods, okay? And so Southerners are very against tariffs. And again, this only leads to the idea that sectionalism is getting more and more intense. Anyways, tariff abominations, okay, the South is very upset. South Carolina in particular, okay, there is a pamphlet or an exposition that is published by at that time, the Vice President John C. Calhoun, who says, you know what, South Carolina doesn't have to pay this, okay, because it hurt them so bad. They should be able to nullify this tax, this tariff. And remember, nullify means not listen to. Where have we heard this before? We've heard this with the Alien Sedition Acts. Remember, Jefferson and Madison, they said we're going to nullify the Alien Sedition Acts by John Adams, okay, that states should not have to listen to a federal law if they think they are unconstitutional. And I told you back then this was a very dangerous precedent to set. And here we are, 1828, South Carolina is starting to do the same thing. And now you have a standoff. And remember, whose job is it to enforce laws? The president. And the president, Andrew Jackson, says, listen, South Carolina, although I am a Southerner and I don't like tariffs, it's my duty, it's my job to enforce the law, and you must pay the tariff. Oh, really? Now you want to enforce the laws, right? Andrew Jackson, a little bit of a hypocrite there, because in the Indian Removal Act, he decided not to enforce the ruling of John Marshall. Anyways, back to this. South Carolina is really pissed off. They said, we're not going to pay it. Andrew Jackson says, you must. He threatens to bring in the military. And South Carolina says, if you do that, we threaten to secede from the Union. That means leave. So how do we resolve this? We actually have the compromiser of all compromisers. Henry Clay once again saves the day with a compromise. He says, listen, here's what we're going to do. In order to save the Union and the tariff issue here, the nullification crisis, he offers what's called the olive branch and sword, okay? It means that we are going to collect the tax. South Carolina, you have to pay the tariff. But what we'll do is we will negotiate a tariff that will lower over the course of the next few years, okay? So pay it now and we will lower it, and that's how we'll compromise here. This was passed. South Carolina approves, and nullification is rescinded, meaning they took it back, and the Union is preserved from now. Again, though, nullification, the idea of it, is setting a very dangerous precedent, and this isn't good. But for now, we have peace. All right, Andrew Jackson's nullification crisis is averted, if you will. Okay, just talk about the states' rights versus federal supremacy argument. Okay, and this goes all the way back, okay, to our beginning days of our country. People that are in favor of states' rights believe that the southern states essentially should have more power than the federal government. We've talked about this. The Articles of Confederation was all about states' rights, whereas the Constitution is all about federal supremacy. People were for that and against it. We've identified them over the course of time. I will direct your attention to that cartoon on the slide, though. That cartoon on the slide is depicting Andrew Jackson as a monarch. There, you see all the words around it: born to command, King Andrew I. Okay, veto is in his hand. We'll talk about that in a second. The Constitution is on the floor, all ripped up. So, what kind of message is this sending about Andrew Jackson? That maybe he's, viewing himself as a monarch, viewing himself as a ruler with complete, absolute control. Who knows? So the next thing we're going to get into is his bank wars, okay, and we'll see what that means in a second. But essentially, if you remember back to almost the beginning of our course, okay, chapter 6 again, we had the Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury, who came up with the first national bank, the idea for it in his financial plan. That was only for 20 years, okay, and then a couple of weeks ago we said, okay, the first national bank, the charter was up, and we had to decide, do we want to do it again? And Henry Clay, his American system, he said, yes, let's do it again. It works so well. Let's do it for a second time. But that was only for 20 years. So 1816 plus 20 years brings us to 1836. Andrew Jackson is now still president. What is going to happen with the bank? So essentially, Andrew Jackson being a Southerner, okay, he is not in favor of a national bank, right? A Southerner is usually all about states' rights having more power and is usually against the federal government having too much power, especially a federal entity like the bank. Well, Andrew Jackson's running for re-election in 1832. Henry Clay runs against him, and Henry Clay says, how can I beat this guy? Oh, here's what I'll do. I'll bring up the issue of the national bank. Henry Clay knows that Andrew Jackson is not a proponent of the national bank. So he says, I'm going to bring it up in the election. People are going to see that he doesn't like it. They're going to hate him, and they will not elect him to be president. Well, it doesn't exactly go to plan, and this kind of backfires on Henry Clay. He brings it up in the election. Jackson obviously takes the bait in the sense that he says he does not support it. But then he goes a step further and he vetoes the rechartering of the national bank. Then Andrew Jackson wins the presidency. So bringing up the national bank a little bit early in 1832 was probably a mistake by Henry Clay. Andrew Jackson says, no, I don't want the national bank for a third time. He vetoes the rechartering of it. This is now going to turn into a little bit of a mess. Andrew Jackson didn't necessarily intend for this to happen. So the battle over the national bank between Andrew Jackson and at the time the president of the national bank, this guy Nicholas Biddle, it gets very intense. Remember, the national bank is constitutional. Okay, this court case, McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, declared the national bank to be constitutional. We've had it before. It is constitutional. However, Jackson's veto of the national bank is only one of his many vetoes. Now, remember, in that little cartoon back a couple slides ago, I mentioned there was a veto in his hand. Here's really why. He vetoed more than any of the first 6 presidents combined. Take a look at this chart. Okay, you can see all the first presidents and how many vetoes they had. Remember, a veto means that you say no to Congress, okay, when they try to propose a bill to you. You see regular vetoes, you see a pocket veto. A pocket veto, just so you know, you don't necessarily have to know this, a pocket veto is when you leave something on your desk, like a bill, and you let it expire. You don't sign it or you don't put the stamp of veto on it, okay? And that just means pocket veto. It's the same action as if you were to say no. You're just wasting time, essentially, if you pocket veto. But you can see there that Andrew Jackson vetoes 12 bills, okay, more than any of the first 6 presidents combined. So what's to become of the national bank? We know that it's vetoed. It's not going to recharter in 1836. It's done. What he does is he withdraws all the funds, all the money from the national bank. His intent is to destroy it, and he puts them into what he calls pet banks. These are state banks. Remember, states should have more power, according to Andrew Jackson, the Southerner. And Nicholas Biddle, the president of the National Bank, he's got to do something to keep this alive, okay, for these last few years until it's over. He calls in loans. He asks for people's money back that he lent out. That's obviously a mess, okay, because it doesn't necessarily even get that money back. Jackson realizes at the very end of his presidency things may not be going very well and an economic collapse is in its future. So he issues what's called the specie circular, in which he says, okay, in order to pay for land, you need hard currency, gold or silver. Now, back in the day, we were on the gold standard, which meant you can actually bring your paper money to the bank and say, in exchange for my $100 bill, I want gold, and they would give you gold. Today, we're no longer on that gold standard, so don't go to the bank with a $100 bill saying, I want gold in return for this. They'll laugh at you, okay? It doesn't happen. Back then, though, the specie circular was supposed to say, okay, hard currency instead of paper currency to buy land. That doesn't work because people don't want to give up their gold and silver. That was a mess. That only led to the further destruction of the economy. As he leaves office in 1837, his boy Martin Van Buren, okay, his second vice president, comes in to be the next president and really leaves him with a mess. The Panic of 1837 is going to now happen under Martin Van Buren, even though it was really all because of Andrew Jackson, okay, because of the specie circular, because of the destroying the national bank, and over speculation in lands. If you remember what over speculation means, it means that you are seeing people buy up land out in the West expecting to sell it for a profit. You're speculating, okay? Things don't go very well. That's the political cartoon of the battle there. We've talked about this cartoon. Got it. The election of 1832, we already mentioned. Jackson wins re-election. He runs up against Henry Clay. It doesn't work out for him. We talked about the parties splitting here. Now, new political parties, okay, I mentioned this earlier that they split into the Democrats, or what we call the Democratic Republicans. They're your Jacksonian followers. This is all the stuff on the left here we mentioned. The national small government, states should have more power. These are Southerners and Westerners. Now, the National Republicans, the people that followed Adams, we're now going to call them the Whigs. Okay, they are strong central government supporters. They are supporters of Henry Clay's American system. They're mostly Northerners, manufacturers, business owners, etc. Okay, and these are your two new political parties we're going to have for a while. The Democrats are the modern-day Democrat Party. The Whigs, are they your modern Republicans? Yes and no. We'll see what I mean by that, but we're going to see political parties kind of take a 180 over time. So for now, those are our two political parties. This is a really nice chart, I think, to put into perspective what our political parties have become thus far. Remember in the very beginning, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, then the Federalists die out by the Hartford Convention. The era of good feelings sees the Democratic Republicans reign. They split because of Jackson. The Democrats become the Jacksonians. The National Republicans, or what we're going to call the Whigs, are your John Quincy Adams followers. That's where we are with political parties as of now. Okay, in comes Martin Van Buren. Okay, that is, Jackson's boy, and, that kind of was probably a mistake. Martin Van Buren was really set up for failure because he's not only Marine's dad with those sweet sideburns there, but he was really set up for a disaster because of Andrew Jackson's policies with the bank and so on. All right, that's it for Chapter 10. Again, if I skipped over anything too fast, go and rewatch. I hope this helped, though. If you think this helped, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, have a wonderful day, peeps.